Tuia I runga, tuia I raro, tuia I roto, tuia I waho. Tuia te pau here tangata, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao. Nau mai te ihi, te wehi, te wana, te mana, te tapu. Kia taua e te mauri tū, te mauri ora ki te katoa. Kia rahi ia mātou, e tutuki pai ai ngā wawata me ngā whainga kei mua i te aroaro. Tēnei te kaupapa ka hikina, tēnei te mauri o te kaupapa ka whakarewa. Koia kei runga, koia kei raro. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā haue whā, tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou katoa. A very warm welcome to you all attending this virtual launch of the APEC Business Advisory Council report to APEC economic leaders. My thanks to Eruera Kipa for starting our meeting in the customary way. E te rangatira, a tēnā koe. I'm Stephen Jacoby. I serve as Executive Director of APEC for 2021. You may also know me from the New Zealand International Business Forum, which provides advice and support to APEC. I'm pleased to be joined today by our chair, Rachel Taulele, and by her fellow APEC members, Malcolm Johns and Anna Curzon, and by my colleague, APEC New Zealand Deputy Executive Director, Stephanie Honey, and you'll be hearing from the whole team shortly. It's been our task this year to guide APEC's work in providing advice and recommendations to APEC economic leaders. APEC is made up of 3 members from each of APEC's 21 economies, and we come together this year with chair to express the business voice of APEC. Now, this morning, you should have received our final report, which represents the considered views of all 63 members of APEC. And it's that report that we're proud to present to you today. So here's how our event will proceed. First, we'll hear from Rachel, who'll provide an overview presentation of the main lines of the report. Then I'll moderate a panel discussion with Rachel and other members of the team, which will lead into an opportunity for you to ask probing questions of our panel. Please use the Q&A function and get those questions rolling in. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Rachel Taulele, the APEC chair for 2021. Rachel is very well known in the business community. She's a strong advocate for the Maori economy and for sustainability in the food and beverage sector. She was formerly CEO of the food and beverage company Kono, and her new role is as co-founder of the business design and brand strategy firm Oho. Tēnā koe, Rachel, aki a koe.
Kia ora, Stephen. I ngā mana, i ngā reo, rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm humbled to share with you today the APEC report to APEC economic leaders, and welcome to all of you who have joined us. I see a number of friends online, including my whanaunga, Johnny McGregor, and my former chair, Paul Morgan, who actually allowed me the time to even participate in the process of APEC. So this is perhaps an opportune moment to say thank you to the both of you for giving me this time. It's certainly flown. In 2 weeks' time, to that point, my APEC colleagues and I will have the privilege of presenting this report, as I said, to the APEC leaders and discussing the way ahead with them for our region. The report reflects an extraordinary year. We have needed to bring together perspectives from 63 members hailing from a region that spans 11 time zones and some of the smallest as well as some of the biggest economies in the world. We have confronted some truly once-in-a-generation challenges, from the pandemic to inclusion to digital disruption. Throughout, our APEC team in New Zealand, which you may be able to see on your screen, I'm not sure, but they have worked closely with our ministers who have really genuinely been outstanding, and our officials, in our shared effort to navigate effectively through what's been a very complex landscape. And of course, getting it done in 2021 has had its operational challenges too. We've had 5 working groups, 16 task forces, 43 specific recommendations and 5 detailed annexes, all developed through a myriad of video conferences, through emails and phone calls, and of course, a lot of that has been spent reminding people of the fact that they might have been mute in the process. I'm very proud of how our APEC New Zealand team, including the APEC members themselves, have risen to the challenge, and in particular, the support of Stephen Jacoby and Stephanie Honey, Carrie Stoddard and Gleb Candy in the process and supporting us and the work that we've done has been immense. As chair, I've been supported by an outstanding group of men and women, business leaders from across our region, leading working groups and task forces, and helping to sustain the thought leadership and the unity that is APEC's real strength. I know that when we hand the baton to Thailand next year, actually technically that will happen in a couple of weeks' time, not that I'm counting, with APEC, it's still in fighting form to carry on its very important work. So what is it that we have been working on? And this is a question, as you might imagine, that I am regularly asked by my peers. Our APEC theme this year has been people, place and prosperity, o tangata tai ao me te tauri kura. Looking back on the year, that theme could hardly have been more apt as our communities, our environment and our economies have faced challenges that at times have felt existential. Our theme puts us and the needs of interests of people at the heart of everything that we do. It recognises that we cannot achieve prosperity or sustainability or inclusion in a silo, and that each one of those 3 concepts helps to support and amplify the others. The first of our 5 working groups has been focused on the core area of APEC's work, regional economic integration. This work stream is critical to laying the groundwork for economic rebuilding. First, on the pandemic. The report underscores the importance of a coordinated response and the idea that we need to look seriously at both the health and economic challenges. Equitable access to vaccination and freeing up trade in essential medical goods and services will not just safeguard lives, but also make good sense for economic reasons. Vaccination, for example, will help us reopen borders safely once the health situation permits. We are urging leaders through the report to develop a voluntary regional framework for this border reopening process. Getting people moving again will be critical to the recovery of all businesses in the region. The report also emphasises the need to strengthen the region's economic architecture, and there are 3 major parts to this. First, we've urged APEC leaders to come together to champion a stronger, more relevant and credible World Trade Organization. The WTO has served as a strong foundation for Asia-Pacific prosperity over decades, and APEC should do it all it can to support this system. The report also urges leaders to continue to build towards a future free trade area of the Asia-Pacific. We would like to see a model of seamless economic integration in which it will one day be as easy to live, work and do business in any one part of our region as it is to do it in the other. We can use the deep and wide FTAs that have been negotiated in recent years as building blocks for this. Third, the report points out that the critical role that services play in productivity, growth and innovation. The sector has been hard hit by the pandemic, but APEC's international competitiveness has already been slipping before COVID, and we need to do more to boost this sector. Our second major focus is on sustainability. In an age where COVID is, frankly, a curtain raiser for an even bigger threat of climate change, APEC wants to see the region position itself as a leader in sustainability thought and action. Malcolm Johns has led the development of a set of climate leadership principles for business. We hope that these principles can galvanise action across APEC economies and indeed one day might be adopted more broadly. We've also developed ideas for a new framework for trade and investment in renewable energy. Again, this is an important piece of the puzzle for the incentivising and enabling the fundamental behavioural challenge that greater sustainability demands. Finally, under this heading of food system, APEC has been able to closely be involved in the development of a new APEC food security roadmap. This is so important. We will struggle to achieve lofty goals about economic integration or digital if people don't have enough to eat. APEC maintains that we need a food system that is sustainable, inclusive, digitally enabled, and trade-friendly. I mentioned earlier that the needs and interests of our people must be at the heart of everything we do. We have tried to develop practical ways that the disadvantaged and underrepresented can gain access to the opportunities and sharing the benefits of growth through the inclusion work stream. Our specific recommendations under this heading include a deeper conversation with businesses about social and economic impacts of different policies. A dashboard could even be established to measure this. We're also recommending a range of practical ways to secure greater participation in business and trade for women, small businesses, and Indigenous people, including by building skills, investing in infrastructure, and making sure that enabling tools like timely payments for small businesses give them a starting point for success. I was especially energized by the chance this year to lead our work on Indigenous economic development. We hosted the first ever Indigenous Business Leaders Dialogue in July, involving over 90 delegates from 8 economies. We came up with some important messages about the need to build capability and opportunities for the small but potentially mighty force in our region. And by small, I'm meaning around 245, 270 million people. To digital, it will not surprise you to hear that we've had a broad and deep agenda in this area. If nothing else, COVID has shown that digital technologies can be one of the key enablers, not just for resilient growth, but also for inclusion and more sustainable ways of doing business. The first task force, led by Anna Curzon, focuses on the digital transformation of small businesses. We've developed a range of practical recommendations, including ways to build up their digital skills through a new region-wide platform and help them access important productivity-enhancing tools like e-invoicing. We also stress the need for greater interoperability between digital systems for trade. For example, around digital documents, e-signatures, global data standards, and cybersecurity. Digital technologies can unlock markets for our goods as well as our service exporters, but not if data and systems cannot connect across borders. We're also recommending the creation of a more enabling and high trust environment for artificial intelligence, including in the health sector, where of course the pandemic has brought the potential benefits vividly to life. Our final work stream has been centred on economic issues. There have been 3 particular areas where APEC has focused this year. We've adopted a stepped up approach to economic recovery from COVID, ongoing structural reform, and increased attention to disaster preparedness. Our key messages are that stimulus and support measures are key to the economic recovery, but that also we should learn from the lessons of the pandemic to get match fit for future crises. Overarching all of our year's work has been the support for the ambitious implementation of the APEC Putrajaya vision for 2040. This was a vision that APEC leaders agreed to last year. It calls for an open, dynamic, resilient and peaceful Asia-Pacific community by 2040 for the prosperity of all of our people and future generations. And that is a great aspiration. But our key message to leaders is that we cannot afford to take another 20 years to get there. 2021 has been stormy, to put it mildly, but we can see this as a time, as a new dawn for a better future. We should start today and implement those good ideas as soon as is practical. You should have all received a copy of the report emailed to you this morning. It will also be available on the TradeWorks website. The details are on the slide. We look forward to discussing these ideas in more detail with you now and receiving your feedback. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Rachel, and thank you very much for that overview of what has been a very busy and impactful year. We come now to the panel discussion, and along with Rachel, I'm very pleased to welcome our colleagues. First, Malcolm Johns. Malcolm is the CEO of Christchurch International Airport, and he holds a number of other governance roles. Welcome to Anna Curzon. Anna leads Xero's global product team, overseeing the design and build of products and services for small businesses and their advisors. And welcome to Stephanie Honey. Stephanie is an international trade policy consultant, a former trade negotiator and diplomat. Kia ora koutou katoa. Look, let's start with a sort of easy question, shall we? What's it been like this virtual year of APEC? Rachel, you mentioned the number of times that people were on mute. I thought that was probably an underestimation. It did seem quite a large figure. But what's it been like?
I have been thinking about that and reflecting, because I've been asked that a number of times recently. And my landing point for all of that is that most of you, I hope, have been to Te Papa. And upstairs where the marae is, where Te Papa is, there's this huge stone that's pounamu. And, you know, people come past and they get the stones and they rub them. And I think for me, this entire process, a little bit like that piece of pounama, is that, you know, we play our part, we wash it with water, we rub it with stones, we try to glean from that what we can. And over the course of a number of years, I think the beauty finally shines through. So slow, steady, hastened somewhat by the fact that we went online, and after the initial fright, everyone, you know, sort of relaxed into the idea that it would be virtual. But slow and steady. We had big shoes to fill, but it's been fascinating at a bare minimum.
Thanks, Rachel. What about you, Malcolm?
I think New Zealand should take a bow, and particularly Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, for the way that they pivoted so quickly to doing everything online. The quality of the production, the quality of the support, the quality of the organisation, I think, has been outstanding. And the reality for us is that this will be part of our post-COVID new normal. Personally, as someone who really values human-to-human connection, I hope it's not all of our new normal, that we still get to connect with our colleagues from around the region. But I do take my hat off to the way that New Zealand has delivered both APEC and APEC this year.
Thanks, Malcolm. Take a bow, APEC colleagues listening to this event today. And Anna, I mean, you inhabit this digital space, so you must have been very much at home.
Kia ora. Yeah, it was familiar in many respects. However, I think Rachel mentioned the 11 time zones that we were dealing with. So at times it was fantastic because we could all be in a room, but at the same time, that might be at 1 a.m. in the morning with regional dignitaries and officials and policymakers. And so I just, you know, remember a few times with a big flask of coffee there, and it was, you know, the equivalent of a business attire mullet, if you like, having a business on the top and potentially yoga pants or pajamas on the bottom. And having these very, very significant discussions. But look, I really want to reiterate what Malcolm has said. This has been, so many things have been thrown at us through this process, but it really has been exceptional in terms of the way that the team have pivoted. And in many ways, I think we've built stronger connections because of that. We've also been able to get different presenters and perspectives into the virtual room from around the world to help us with our thinking and help to challenge us as well. I think because we have been virtual, so net I actually think has been a really positive thing, but like Malcolm, looking forward to meeting people in person next year as well.
Thanks very much, Anna. And Steph, late nights listening to 21 economies give their views on some, on occasions, arcane topics.
Well, Stephen, you know me, I love nothing better than an arcane topic, but it has had its advantages as well. I do think that, you know, it's enabled what are basically extremely busy senior business leaders from around the region to actually really come together and dig down into these issues. And let's face it, it's never been more important than it is this year, it has been this year, to have those conversations. I mean, we're facing a very challenging picture across a sweep of, you know, from COVID to the geopolitics to digital disruption. And actually, it has been fantastic to be able to capture the attention of these APEC members from around the region to have those important conversations and engage with the policymakers too. So certainly lots of late nights, but plenty of great stuff to come out of it too, as Rachel highlighted in her report.
Oh, well, thanks all. I mean, a key year that obviously we're going to look back on with some degree of amazement. But look, let's go into the detail of the report. Malcolm, you've been leading ABAC's work on climate change. Obviously, it's very much in the news at the moment as we head into COP26. What role does ABAC see business playing in responding to the challenges of climate change?
Stephen, I think through the history of APEC and ABAC, climate change has been quite a contentious issue. I think where we've moved to now is that there is broad acceptance of climate change. And one of the things that's been very interesting is what climate change means for each economy is different. And that often underscores the way that they approach the discussion on climate change. So what we've looked for is how do we build a set of first principles for the way that business could approach climate change, both from a business perspective, but also in terms of advancing into regional trade policy in the future. And the group that we've led has focused on three broad principles as the framework for addressing that. The first is reduction, the second is adaptation, and the third is just transition. Reduction is one that I think most people will be familiar with, and what we've advocated for is the measurement and reporting on a science-based target approach, the emissions for businesses across the region. This will be important going forward as energy-intensive products come into trade policy and climate change becomes part of our regional trading framework. Adaptation is one that's really interesting because that's how we're going to adapt over the next 30 years to the climate change that's already in train. And we saw the New Zealand Reserve Bank yesterday, for example, note that 14 airports in New Zealand may not survive sea level rise in the next 30 years. For a small trading nation like New Zealand, we look internationally and the vast majority of airports that we connect with will be in a similar position. So adaptation is going to be something that all economies need to grapple with as they continue to maintain their standard of living. The third is just transition, and we've seen from COVID what a major event can do to different parts of our communities, and that the impact of that event is not broadly even. Just transition is about understanding that climate change may be 50 times more impactful than COVID was. And those same communities that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID are likely to be impacted by climate change. So ensuring that we are taking everybody with us on that transition is exceptionally important. As we look forward to the years ahead in terms of APEC, that just transition discussion, I think, is going to be one of the really important discussions we have. And in closing, I'd just like to acknowledge the Sustainable Business Network in New Zealand for the support that they've given us as we've worked through these quite difficult issues.
Thanks, Malcolm. And the full set of principles are included in our report as an annex for everybody to have a look at. A reminder to everybody who's listening in that we're going to give you some time to ask some questions yourselves. So please put them in the Q&A function, which you have at the bottom of your screen. Anna, to you now. You led a task force this year on digital transformation of small businesses. I know that's a topic that is something that is very close to your heart. Can you tell us a bit more about this new SME platform that you are recommending?
For sure. Thank you for that, Stephen. Well, look, I think it's pretty clear that we've seen a permanent digital transformation of the landscape in across Asia Pacific, and McKinsey, and many of you will have seen this data, have estimated that we've leapfrogged a decade from a digital perspective. So we already knew that digital had the capability to unlock or democratize success, if you like, for small business. Now that's more apparent than ever. Unfortunately, lots of our small businesses around the region just aren't equipped for this. So, you know, COVID's hit them even harder. It's a double whammy from where we were at, if you like, a few years ago. We know that SMEs lag behind when it comes to using e-commerce platforms, and that's particularly relevant here in New Zealand, things like websites and social media, but also in those really important back-end services like cloud computing, e-invoicing, and a whole host of other services that really can enable good business and lower trade costs. So that means that they're not as productive and nimble as they need to be able to survive and thrive in this really challenging environment. Now, before COVID, before the pandemic hit, at Xero, we actually commissioned some research with NZIER into cloud computing. And that study found unequivocally that increasing the use of cloud technology would pay significant dividends for small businesses and the New Zealand economy overall, from a productivity perspective, a GDP perspective, etc. But during that research, we also found that lots of small businesses felt that they didn't have the time, they didn't have the knowledge and the skills to digitize. And things like cost was a bit of an impediment as well. So there's clearly a mindset issue here. Businesses are feeling overwhelmed. They're feeling worried about whether they can trust new technology and not necessarily taking that global mindset as opposed to, you know, a more local outlook to their business models. And we've found that even through COVID, you know, things like resistance to change, even though you know change is a good thing, in a moving world, just keeping cadence the way it is and staying the same seems to be a bit of a default position. There's also uncertainty about outcomes. If you're not well educated about technology or you can't call on the support or advice, it's really hard to take that leap of faith. And you might also feel like, gosh, I'm just trying to keep my business afloat. I've got more immediate priorities than trying to lean into completely digitizing my business. So, you know, the upshot is a lot of businesses just prefer to avoid the prospect of digitization altogether. So the work I led in APEC this year was really aimed at that. It was aimed at helping SMEs with this issue. Now, I want to say that we recognise there's a wealth of resources out there. In fact, government programs like the excellent Digital Boost program that MB funded, in which Frances Valentine is running here in New Zealand, has just been excellent, and we've seen some great results from that. Also, big tech companies and private businesses have lots of capability building resources. But again, it's really hard to find some of those right across the region. So we want to bring all those elements together in a one-stop shop for small businesses around APEC. So they have equal access to all the great ideas and support that we can provide them. There's also the startup ecosystem, and we're seeing more and more small businesses start up through COVID. And of course, some of those startups can grow into billion-dollar unicorns, but they need the information, they need the connections to venture capital, and they need good networks. So our concept could help here as well. In fact, there is something that APEC already has, which could form a basis for this. It's called the SME marketplace, but it does need to be reshaped, resourced, and supported to do the job. So that is the next step in the journey. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, thanks, Anna. I mean, this digital space is a complicated one, and I guess it's about trying to bring together the best programs, advice that we've got, and putting them all together in one place. So that would only benefit, I would think, SMEs right across our region. So thanks for that. Rachel Ehor, your work this year has been, well, right across the agenda, but you have focused on the important Indigenous agenda in APEC and in APEC, which is a new thing. You mentioned earlier that you brought together for the very first time Indigenous business leaders from around the region. What were some of the key messages that came out of that first gathering?
Thank you, and I will answer that question, but it's when I hear Anna and Malcolm, it makes me laugh because you bring in these business people with a very strong bias towards action, and half of the challenge with the council is winding people back towards the advice space. So love hearing them report back on their reflections of their task forces. But yes, mine was inclusion, among other things, and we did have the dialogue, and there were three main objectives for the dialogue. The first was to meet with Indigenous business leaders from a range of APEC economies. The second was to learn about their business, trade and economic priorities. And then thirdly, to agree on a set of statements to bring to the attention of APEC as an annex to the report to leaders. And I'm really pleased to say that whilst those, I know that we all agree amongst ourselves are probably quite modest objectives, the quality of the discussion at the event certainly exceeded our expectations, and that we've also been successful in having that third point, which is the statement affixed as an annex to the report, actually see the light of day, which was no mean feat. We discussed at that meeting the common barriers that Indigenous businesses faced and what was needed to secure their success in economic activity and trade. We made recommendations in 5 areas which gained unanimous endorsement. The first was to ensure that Indigenous peoples have access to the resources necessary for the well-being and economic security of their communities, and a seat at the APEC table to keep the conversation going, and that's really key. The second was by working in partnership across the sector to stimulate and incentivise the growth and scalability of Indigenous businesses. The third was to meet the infrastructure needs, including digital infrastructure of rural and remote Indigenous communities, as critical to underpinning their success in the digital age. Fourth, to expanding the range of relevant and useful data collected for Indigenous business needs and recognise and support the role of prior informed consent in the collection of Indigenous people's business and economic data. And finally, to explore how Indigenous communities or Indigenous economies could benefit from existing trade agreements and how to reflect the needs of Indigenous businesses and the pathways to the eventual free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So I suppose I would characterize it as tough going, but certainly worth the challenge. And it's also just the first step on what's perhaps a never-ending journey. It's like the 500-year plan we have within Wakatu Te Pai Tawhiti, that distant horizon. You never actually reach it, but it's certainly the journey needs to take you towards that place.
Well, kia ora. I remember that there was a very high level of excitement and engagement during that event that was hosted back in July. And just to remind everybody that the full set of statement is contained in an annex in our report. These are the words of the people who attended the event, and we have been able to draw that to the attention of leaders. So refer that for your consideration. And a reminder to everybody, if you've got questions, please do pop them in the Q&A and we'll get to them in just a moment. Steph, now to you. You've been working hard on the food agenda. We heard about the food security roadmap in Rachel's presentation earlier. APEC has for a long time been involved in food security, but what does that mean exactly in the APEC context? And what role in particular does APEC see trade playing in achieving food security for the region?
Well, thanks, Stephen. This probably sounds like one of those arcane topics you mentioned earlier, but in fact, it's a really very practical thing for people in the region, but also for New Zealand food producers. So fundamentally, this is about making sure that everybody in the region has sufficient, safe, nutritious and affordable food. And APEC has been very closely involved in this agenda for a long time, including this year, as you mentioned, and as Rachel talked about, producing this new food security roadmap for the region for the next decade. So essentially, from an APEC perspective, we're really keen to make sure that the food system overall works effectively. And so that's about making sure people have the food to eat, but it's also about making sure that our systems for food production, trade, distribution, consumption are sustainable, are trade friendly and digitally enabled. And we really have quite a big job of work ahead of us. Unfortunately, there's still quite a lot of food insecurity in the region. So that's people going hungry or being malnourished. And we've seen an exacerbation of that through COVID, but unfortunately, we're also likely to see these ongoing disruptions as climate change impacts really start to bite as well. Obviously, food production is pretty vulnerable to impacts from the climate too. And we see trade as playing a really big part in the solution for that. In its crudest sort of terms, we're talking about matching up supply with demand. And as we see disrupted climate effects and other challenges, if we can call on a sort of a regional food basket, each individual economy, then we need to be, less worried about things like droughts, floods, other disruptions, biosecurity incursions, because we can call on the whole region's food production for security. But unfortunately, in our region, those trade barriers are still a headache. So we see that across the region, on average, agriculture tariffs are about 3 times the tariffs for manufactured goods, and some pretty mighty tariff peaks across the markets. Non-tariff barriers are growing, and we saw quite a number of those new barriers being introduced through the last 18 months or so, thanks to COVID, sort of knee-jerk responses as well. And subsidies are at record highs. There are some really big spenders in our region, and unfortunately, the predictions that New Zealand and others have made in the WTO context is that the sort of 6 biggest spenders in our region could legally spend $800 billion of WTO consistent subsidies over the next decade. So we need to see trade reform, and that's one of the things that APEC's been advocating for: get those tariffs down, reduce the subsidies. That has a big payoff for food security, but also there are real benefits in terms of sustainable production. Those high subsidies are associated with a lot of environmental harms. And of course, for producers like New Zealand, it's a more level playing field. So it's a really important mahi. It's something that we're really committed to, and we want to see a sort of a win-win solution in this area.
That was me. I was on mute. Hey, that's now 5,797. Steph, that's one of the key areas for New Zealand, isn't it? Obviously, food trade, where this work that's going on in APEC can have immediate impact. So it's one we want to keep focusing on in years to come. Malcolm, I want to come back to you now. There's a companion piece for your work on climate leadership in the renewable energy space. And this year, APEC has worked on developing a framework for trade and investment in renewable energy. Why is that important?
Thanks, Stephen. That was a piece of work led by the Australian delegation and supported ably by a number of stakeholders here in New Zealand in its initial stages. One of the things that's very interesting is that the trade framework for non-renewable energy is very well established in the world and between economies. Renewable energy is a little bit different in that it often attaches to microgrids, and it often has not only the energy itself, but also the IP, the software and the hardware that goes along with the generation and distribution of that. So this piece of work really looked at, first of all, identifying what are the existing barriers in the trade of renewable energy from an energy, a software and a hardware perspective. And it identified a number of tariff and non-tariff barriers to that occurring. And the piece of work, which you can find in Annex D, I think it is, in the report, outlines the summation of that investigation and the framework for where this piece of work will go for or go to in the coming years, which I think is going to be incredibly important for the reduction component of those first principles and the just transition component as well.
Thank you for that, Malcolm. Again, another area that's going to kind of grow in importance, particularly as we see the growing emphasis on renewable developments, green hydrogen and those sort of things here in New Zealand. And I know work earlier. Rachel, I'd like to ask you now about the trade element. There are a few questions actually popping up on the Q&A about trade. Obviously, there's been a focus on the WTO that you mentioned, but also I see Philip Gregan, who's here, asking about the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. Where do those things fit in?
I think it's, and thanks for the question, Philip. I think it's stating the obvious when I say that COVID has had a punishing impact on trade, and that we do need to strengthen the trade architecture in the region. So first, businesses need a WTO system that is credible, strong, and modern. We need to continue the unfinished reform process in areas, as Steph alluded to, in the likes of agriculture, get the dispute system back up and running, and update the rules to respond to exponential growth in the digital economy and services. We're fast coming up on a major meeting of the WTO ministers at the end of November, and our message to leaders is that we want and need APEC economies to take the lead on keeping the WTO relevant and effective, that it's in all of our interests to do so. We also want APEC leaders to speed up the work on creating FTAP, to your question, Philip. We want and can use all of the FTAs that economies have partaken in and done in recent years as the building blocks for a region-wide free trade area. And I think, Stephen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but FTAP was, I think, an APEC idea, and we've steadfastly stayed on it year after year, because our vision is that one day, as I think I said earlier, it will be as easy to work and do business in one part of our region as it is in another. And that will be the same whether you are a business or an entrepreneur, whether you're large and small, but we need the political will to get us there.
That's right, Rachel. FTAP was an APEC idea back in 2004, which just goes to show you that some good ideas really do take time to push through. But look, keep the faith. That's what we really are trying to say in our APEC report to leaders.
Keep rubbing the pounamu.
That's right. Just keep rubbing that pounamu, and eventually the beauty will shine through. As you said, it is a beautiful trade idea, no doubt about it. And another really beautiful idea coming out of APEC this year has been around e-invoicing. Would you like to comment on that?
For sure. And I guess this is another area where we need to continue to rub the pounamu, because there have been some regions that have embraced this and others that are still in that sort of process of adoption. Because we know, as I talked about earlier, that building up really good, solid digital skills and capabilities is super important. But you can't have that without also really analysing the operating environment that's working against small businesses. So some of our other recommendations are about creating that right enabling environment. That is making sure regulations and technical standards and policies that apply around the region are really coherent, they're interoperable, they're business friendly, and that data can flow freely. But also in a way that business and consumers can trust, and that SMEs can access the tools that they need to help them become more efficient and productive. So one of those really important tools that we identified was e-invoicing. We know that one of the biggest headaches, in fact, it's the number one reason why small businesses go out of business, is because of cash flow. And also too, just searching for low cost back office management tools and techniques to support them. So invoicing ticks both of those boxes. It will help small businesses to get paid faster with less hassle. It will also mean less time on admin, as invoice data is just seamlessly integrated into their platform. So it's freeing them up to do better, kind of beautiful business and to become more innovative, and really does help to stimulate the flow of value through our different regions and economies. So in effect, e-invoicing is going to help owners work on their business, not in their business. And of course, to achieve better uptake of e-invoicing, including across borders, and the People Network and other networks that support e-invoicing are really starting to explore that now. It is going to take an effort from regulators as well as technology providers to ensure that we're all lined up, and to ensure that systems, regulations and infrastructure are interoperable. So we are recommending, as part of our report, that leaders really direct their officials and regulators to ensure that e-invoicing can be as accessible and interoperable as possible around the region. I think, as someone said earlier, I think Rachel mentioned, we want to make sure that even if you're a small business, it feels as simple and easy to do business across the region as it does currently within your own economy. Thank you.
Is one of the newer developments, isn't it? Because earlier we used to talk about, a seamless economy in terms of doing business, in terms of physical presence, in terms of tariff-free. But now we're talking about using these digital tools to do it. And I just thought I might, as a follow-on to that one, just ask Steph briefly about, digital tools to facilitate goods trade. Perhaps this has come up in particular in the food system work that you have been doing. We talk about a digitally enhanced food system. Do you want to talk about that a bit for us?
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, this is not, cows getting on the internet to make things work. It's actually really recognising the potential benefits of digital technologies, even in, a sort of a more traditional sector like agriculture and food production. So throughout the food value chain, APEC sees this enormous potential to increase productivity and yields, become more efficient, have greater visibility through the supply chain, at the production end with things like agri-tech, but also through distribution, so logistics and fantastic innovations like, trade windows, blockchain platform for supply chain management, through to e-commerce platforms to enable, producers to sort of sell more directly to customers around the region. So there's a huge scope to do that, but it can't just happen by itself. What we are trying to encourage leaders to think about is how to create that enabling environment to help digital technologies make the food sector work more efficiently and smoothly and with higher integrity. And so we've advocated for a digital food systems plan that's part of that food security roadmap I talked about earlier, to really enable New Zealand producers, but producers all around the region to get the best out of those technologies.
And this too is ongoing, isn't it? Because the implementation of that plan is going to have to be worked on next year, right?
That's right, Stephen. And I mean, we have some really great building blocks in there already. For instance, global data standards, something that APEC has been advocating for many years as well, is kind of mentioned in there. But there are a whole bunch of other areas where we really need to build out that ecosystem as Anna said, interoperability is an absolutely core concern, and really just keep plugging away at making the digital economy for the food and agriculture sector really, working at its peak. So there'll be a lot of work to do, a lot of opportunities, I think, for stakeholders to feed in their, priorities and interests and insights into that work as well.
Great. Malcolm, I want to come back to you, and we're entering now into the Q&A session because we've got quite a few questions coming up now. And I was going to ask you anyway about kind of the APEC's work on border reopening, but I see a question from our friend Pierre Smolders from Alibaba, who's referring to the APEC's recommendations for greater coordination at the regional level on COVID response and on borders. Pierre observes that for many countries, however, they seem to be adopting unilateral approaches to all of that. The question is, do you think that's going to change? What effect will APEC's recommendations have? What is APEC recommending in this space?
First of all, kia ora, Piers. I'm happy to certainly take your question. And it's good to see you on the call, by the way. Alibaba has a close relationship with Christchurch Airport and has done for some time. One of the things that's interesting as you watch these events play out is they have three distinct phases. And we're in phase 2 of this event at the moment, and that's the transition phase. Phase 1 is about, in this event, has been about protecting people's, domestic population risk, if you like. So where you've had a border, it's been a defining line between the risk inside the country and the risk outside the country. What we're seeing across the region as we transition to vaccines and therapies and much more knowledge about this disease is that the risk inside countries and the risk outside countries is balancing. And as that risk balances, the relevance of the border and restrictions on the border drop away. And we're seeing that in New Zealand right now. We've got pending announcements on MIQ, and that's largely because the risk inside the Auckland community is now greater than the risk outside the Auckland community for people coming into it. And so APEC has done a lot of work led by our colleagues in Singapore in particular around how the region can approach this issue. But the reality is that as we move through phase 2 of this event and into phase 3, which is the post-event new normal, much of the risk differential that we were managing a year ago has disappeared. And as that has disappeared, you will see more harmonisation across the different border settings of the region. But that's probably got several months to play out, possibly up to a year to play out, before we reach a post-event stability factor where quite clearly human biosecurity crossing the border is going to be a new factor in travel, just the way that aviation security became a new factor in travel after 9/11. But we in APEC have great confidence that all of our economies will reach that equilibrium and we will be able to renew travel around the region.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. And just to remind that our report has a whole annex on our border reopening recommendations. That's been a major focus of work for APEC this year. Sometimes it seemed that we were getting close to border reopening, only to see the borders snap back shut again. But never mind, we've got a very detailed prescription there for you all to read.
And Stephen, the appendix is known as the Snakes and Ladders appendix because of that. Every time we climb a ladder, we seem to slide down a snake on it.
That's right. That's right. That's right. We were always talking about trying to move beyond the current crisis, and indeed, our report does have some of that, a lot of that in it as well. Rachel, I want to come to one of your whanaunga, I think, Johnny McGregor, who has asked about the government's Trade for All agenda and how it aligns with APEC's report message.
Sure, no problem. Kia ora, Johnny. And I think we'll do this in 2 parts. I'll give one very short opening comment, and then I think Steph, who was particularly invested in the Trade for All agenda, I'll perhaps bounce over to you. But The Trade for All agenda emphasizes inclusion for women, SMEs, Māori regions, and sustainability. So there's a lot of strong overlaps there. So that's, I guess, there's an overarching comment. But to any more detail in terms of those meeting points, Steph?
Thanks, Rach. Yes, I absolutely agree with what you've said. Inclusion is an incredibly, sort of strong cross-cutting theme in what APEC is recommending this year. It's not enough to have prosperity and grow the economy of the region. We need to make sure that we're not leaving anybody behind in that process. And that's obviously very resonant with Trade for All. As Rachel said, we have recommendations across the whole inclusion agenda for women, for example, who have been hit very hard by COVID, about being able to continue to participate in economic activity and trade, for Indigenous peoples, for small businesses, all of those things that we've talked about already. And as Malcolm has discussed, also this very strong theme about making sure that growth is also sustainable. That's absolutely fundamental to our forward work. So I think a lot of resonance there with Trade for All.
I mean, I think the days are long gone, aren't they, that we can just go away and open markets and do trade without regarding, a whole load of other elements, particularly in inclusion and in sustainability. And certainly that's being recognised in New Zealand's trade negotiating effort. But I think it really does underpin the approach that under Rachel's leadership we've taken this year around putting people at the centre of the recommendations that we have. Anna, I wanted to come back to you on the SME question. I know you've commented on this quite a bit, but it kind of flows from the Trade for All side of things again. Sometimes we think that we need, specialist things for SMEs. Other times we think that the recommendations we're making across the board are going to be relevant for SMEs. I mean, can you talk a little bit more about what APEC has been thinking about in relation to SMEs this year?
Sure. Well, look, I think for SMEs, micro, small and medium businesses, it's really interesting because the theme here of inclusion is super important. Ironically, we know that this region is actually one of the most technically enabled regions in the world. Internet penetration ranges from 70 to nearly 100%. It's home to around 80% of the B2B commerce market. It's worth about 12 trillion US dollars. A lot of the big technical and digital firms are in the region: Alphabet, Alibaba, Google, Microsoft, etc. And a lot of our consumers are really digital first as well. So, we know we've got a really excellent environment for SMEs to thrive. And we also know that the number of small businesses have increased substantially over the COVID period. However, it does come back to enabling them in terms of having those key, access to the information, the tools, the advice, and really going above and beyond, as I think we've done in New Zealand through Digital Boost, to incentivize our small businesses to actually break the cadence and take some proactive change. So obviously that's been a really big, important point as well. Digital interoperability has also been very important because every small business should grow up, and I think Singapore's a really outstanding economy in this respect, should start with the perspective that they can be a global business and they can operate seamlessly in the APEC region. And that is really our vision for SMEs, is that from day one, they're thinking about themselves as global. So interoperability, and Steph has also spent a lot of time on this topic as well, has been probably the other key thing in terms of enabling trade. One of the other things that has been really interesting is that, during COVID, a lot of the economies really pivoted quickly to digital customs policies and procedures and processes, which was excellent. But we've actually seen this retreat from that, which is fascinating. And I think one of the things that we really want to make sure we do is encourage the policymakers across the region to take all the friction they can out of trade, especially for small businesses. Rachel talked about women, Indigenous communities. Again, they are disproportionately represented in MSME businesses. And so, we really want to make sure that we're giving them the best chance of success and to be able to bounce back in the same way big businesses have been.
Well, let no one doubt that APEC has been focused on MSMEs this year. It's not just about big business. Look, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the end of our time together, but John Bellingall, our friend, has asked an extremely good question, which I was kind of keeping to last, John, because it kind of sums up a lot of what we've been talking about today. He also gets a Christmas card from us this year because he said we produced a timely, relevant, insightful report. Thank you. We'll take all bouquets. But John asks us to outline what happens next with the report in terms of delivering it to APEC leaders, and which are the recommendations that we think are most likely to be progressed. Of course, everybody's going to say their ones, of course, but Rachel, you might like to kick off answering that one.
I think it's a great question, but a mean question, because it does make you pick your favorite child. And we all know we have one, but no one really likes to say it. But look, for me, it goes in two phases. For me, I sort of really deeply invested in the borders reopening through the movement of vaccines and essential medical goods and services. I think that the faster that happens, the safer we become, the quicker the border reopens, and that we can use trade to restart those economic engines and return us to being that very dynamic region that we've always been. And then beyond that, I just really can't go past digital as the enabler for all of the things that we've been talking about. And there's another question about enabling digital economies in the Indigenous economies. And it's just that tool, it's that unlock for so much of the work that we need to do. So that for me, that would be, I hope, a couple that get off the blocks more quickly than the other.
Kia ora, Rachel. I mean, we've got such a wide variety of recommendations that we are making. Some are going to be implemented in the medium term. Some are going to take a little longer. I'm thinking of Malcolm's work in climate, for example. Climate's always been a very difficult discussion in APEC, hasn't it? But that is starting to change, and that's why we need to keep up this effort. Well, kia ora koutou e te whānau. I think we are coming really to the end now, and we've used up the time we set aside for today's event. We're a couple of minutes off 1 p.m. I feel I need to sit down and a cup of tea when I listen to the team talking about the wide range of things that have been worked on this year. I hope that they have been able to give you something of the flavour of the APEC year and also the tenor of our recommendations to leaders. And I'm pleased to tell you that on the 12th of November at 1 a.m. in the morning, the team will be sitting down virtually, with the APEC economic leaders themselves to discuss the ideas contained in our report. This is the high moment of the APEC year, and it's where a lot of this work that we do comes together, because APEC has a line direct to the economic leaders themselves. Of course, as I said earlier, some of these recommendations aren't just one-off. They're going to provide the basis of an ongoing APEC work program, and we'll be continuing that under the leadership of APEC Thailand next year. On your behalf, I'd like to thank our panel today for their insights and their commitment and their enthusiasm that they've shown all year. And on their behalf, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and for your interest in APEC's work. We very much appreciate the input and guidance that we've received from many of you over the course of the year. We haven't elaborated these recommendations in isolation. Your input is valuable, and we certainly look forward to keeping in touch with you as we move forward. Please do have a look at the APEC pages on our website, tradeworks.org.nz. It contains all of the work that we've been doing, various statements we've made to leaders, to ministers, certainly our report, and other key documents and presentations. So it's been great to have this occasion today to talk to you about all that, and I hope that the rest of the day for you goes well. Nō reira, i ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā rangatirama, tēnā koutou, Kia ora, kia kaha, tēnā tātou katoa.